Hello and welcome to the Great Thinkers podcast, in which current fellows of the British Academy introduce the academics that have inspired their work and shape how we see the world today. GLS Shackle, FBA, spent his career advocating the importance of understanding uncertainty in economics, but his ideas fell out of fashion towards the end of the 20th century. In this episode, economist John Kay, FBA, and the former head of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, FBA, explain why they've come round to Shackle's way of thinking.
I'm John Kay. I'm a fellow of the British Academy. I'm a fellow of St John's College, Oxford. I'm an economist. And my great thinker is GLS Shackle, an economist slightly forgotten, but whose contributions, I think, are highly relevant to some of the contemporary problems we face. Shackle was born in 1903. Straight from school he went to become a bank clerk. He did an external degree at London University and then a PhD at London School of Economics. When the war broke out, Lindemann, often known as the Prof, Lord Cherwell, set up a little think tank to work for Churchill. The youngish Shackle was one of the recruits in that think tank. And he worked there through the war and for another 5 years in the Cabinet Office. But then he became Professor of Economics at the University of Liverpool, which was the job he did till he retired in 1969, just as I was finishing my undergraduate studies. In the 1920s, there was a battle over the attempt to extend the classical theory of probability, which had been developed for repeated events, such as tossing a coin or measuring the heights of a population, to all kinds of events, including unique events that were one-off things that only happened once, by means of what were called subjective probabilities, sometimes also called personal probabilities, or even pygnistic probabilities. Now, back in the 1920s, economists distinguished risk, which could be described probabilistically, from uncertainty or radical uncertainty, which couldn't. And that distinction was the subject of lively debate when two great economists, Frank Knight at the University of Chicago and John Maynard Keynes in Cambridge, England, argued that this distinction between risk and uncertainty was important. And one of the clearest expositions of radical uncertainty is found in an article which Keynes wrote, summarizing his great work, his general theory.
By uncertain knowledge, let me explain. I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known for certain from what is only probable. The game of roulette is not subject, in this sense, to uncertainty, nor is the prospect of a victory bond being drawn, or again the expectation of life is only slightly uncertain. Even the weather is only moderately uncertain. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper and the rate of interest 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of a new invention. About these matters there is no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability whatever. We simply do not know.
On the other side of the debate, there was a colleague of Keynes at King's College, Cambridge, a man called Frank Ramsey, another polymath like Keynes, and there was also a very eccentric Italian statistician called Bruno Di Finetti. And Ramsey and Di Finetti argued that personal probabilities could be used to dispose of radical uncertainty. Everything could be treated as a risk. In the post-war era, radical uncertainty virtually disappeared from the economics mainstream, and probabilities were, became, and still are everywhere ascendant. Now, the distinctive contribution of Shackle is that he kept the flame alive, that distinction between risk and uncertainty, emphasizing the importance of radical uncertainty and the limitations of probabilistic reasoning in an era when these ideas had become unfashionable. Now, the 2008 crisis exposed the limitations of these models, ones which assume that all uncertainty could be turned into risk using probabilities. And I came to the conclusion that the neglect of radical uncertainty is a fundamental problem for modern economics. And my long-term friend and colleague Mervyn King, who was Governor of the Bank of England at the time in 2008, came to that same conclusion. and we're writing a book together about precisely that. It's a pleasure to be here in the same room with Mervyn King to discuss radical uncertainty and to talk about Shackle, because we both think that Shackle, who has become a rather obscure figure, very largely forgotten, we'd like to pluck Shackle out of that obscurity. Mervyn, we've talked a lot about radical uncertainty. How would you define it?
So I think radical uncertainty is where you face up to the realization that we can't write down a long list of all possible future outcomes on a very long piece of paper, and we certainly can't attach probabilities to those events occurring. And that, in essence, is both what drives a market economy, because entrepreneurs, existing companies that produce new products, initially simply do not know what those future products will be. And in macroeconomics, what I came to understand during the crisis was that the economic framework, which relied on people being able to apply quantitative methods in which you did know the probabilities of various future events, led you to the spurious belief that you could price all risks. And maybe some risks can be priced if they are the result of events that occur regularly and frequently, so that you can try to measure the likelihood of their occurring. But most important events that lead to big macroeconomic disturbances are unique events. They're events that people didn't truly understand beforehand. They saw dimly that there were problems, but couldn't quantify what might happen. And I think it just was impossible to think about the behaviour of the economy during and after the financial crisis within a framework that said people could quantify precisely the nature of risks and do a sort of calculus based on the understanding, the numerical understanding of what those risks were. We just did not know what was going to happen.
The connection to entrepreneurship is really important. The smartphone was launched in 2007. If you went back 10 years earlier and said, imagine a computer that you have in your pocket, people would have thought you were mad. No one envisaged that until very shortly before these kind of products actually came on the market. And the great thing which entrepreneurs like Jobs do is to create opportunities that other people have never thought of and products that other people have never thought of.
So what I found striking, John, was that when we began to think about radical uncertainty 6 or 7 years ago, we had come to it through very different routes. I mean, we had written our book on the British tax system 40 years before. Our careers had then moved in different directions. You had come to realise through your work on business how important radical uncertainty was to understanding what business entrepreneurs did. I had moved towards finance and then monetary economics when I moved to the Bank of England. And I had come to understand that it was actually very difficult to comprehend the nature of not just financial crises, but big macroeconomic shocks more generally, without also thinking in terms of radical uncertainty. And coming to it from these two different perspectives, one microeconomic, one macroeconomic, I think made us realise how important that theme of radical uncertainty was to understanding how an economy works.
And there was another aspect of our joint experiences, actually. When we were both mainstream academics, we used, as other economists do, models in which people were optimizing and maximizing things. We both went out into the real world, and we discovered that mostly people weren't maximizing anything. They were just trying to muddle through situations that they only partly understood.
The great success story of Shackle was that he saw the big point and nailed it. And he realised that radical uncertainty was of fundamental importance. And at the end of one or two of his articles, he comes back to the final point saying, even if you don't like the way I have described and analysed this world, nevertheless, I hope that no reader will go away again and believe that uncertainty can be captured by probabilities. That's the key point. And he was absolutely right on that. But he wasn't very good at interacting with others in the profession who were intrigued and fascinated by this way of thinking. But Shackle wasn't very good at interacting with them. And in particular, there was a line of thought introduced by the Chicago statistician Leonard Savage, which actually set out very, very clearly the circumstances in which you could describe behaviour in terms of probabilities. He wrote his famous book, The Foundation of Statistics, setting this out. The remarkable thing is that in that book he says very